Long before a new flag rose over the mountains, Saint Domingue was an empire of sugar. On the North Plain outside Cap Francis, cane fields ran to the horizon like regimented seas, green stalks, white ash from the boiling houses floating in the air, and the creak of mills powered by wind, water, or teams of mules. In the south, coffee climbed terraced hills where cloud and mist kept the leaves glossy. Indigo and cotton filled the gaps. By the 1780s, the colony produced a staggering share of the world's sugar and most of its coffee. French customs ledgers swelled. Bordeaux and Nantes built fortunes on cargoes from this single island. It was, contemporaries said without exaggeration, the richest colony on earth. The price of that wealth was a labor system, so violent it regularly burned through the laborers themselves. Nearly 500,000 enslaved Africans lived and worked in Saint Domingue on the eve of the Revolution, more than 10 times the number of whites, and far more than the roughly 30,000 free people of color. Ships from the Bight of Benin, West Central Africa, and the Congo coast delivered men and women whose languages filled the barracoons: Kikongo and Kimbundu, Fon and Yoruba, Igbo, Wolof. Mortality on sugar estates was so high that planters counted on a steady stream of new captives to replace those crushed by mills, fevers, or punishment. Many were young. Few were allowed to grow old. The rules were written in a book that pretended to be mercy and order, the Code Noir of 1685. It required baptisms into Catholicism, mandated rations and clothing, forbade masters from casually killing slaves, recognized a husband and wife in the eyes of the church, and then, in practice, gave overseers wide license to coerce work with the whip, chain, and cane field stocks. It forbade assembly and travel without passes, threatened branding and mutilation for the crime of running away, and held children in bondage with their mothers. A plantation was a small country ruled by the overseer Garant, the driver Commandeur, and time. Waking bells before dawn, gangs driven in rows, cane cut under sun and rain, green stalks fed into crushing rollers, juice boiled to crystals in the heat of the purgery. Sleep was an intermission, not a reprieve. Power was not simple, even when it felt absolute. People fought back in ways large and small. Petty marronage meant a day or two in the bush to steal a breath of freedom. Grand marronage meant vanishing into the mountains and joining maroon bands that raided estates and made treaties from their strongholds. Knowledge was a weapon. On some plantations, the best healer knew more about herbs and fever than any Parisian physician. In the 1750s, a maroon called Macandal, half legend, half memory, spread fear of poison among planters, a reminder that authority rested on bodies that could sicken and die. Out of a dozen African worlds, a new one took shape. Catholic saints shared calendars with African spirits, drums spoke at night. Creole, born of French vocabulary and African grammars, became the language of work, love, and rumor. Vadu, never a single church, braided Congo rites, Dahomey and Elwaz, and local saints into ceremonies that affirmed kinship when kin had been broken. Weddings were sacred whether or not a priest stood there. Funerals were a way to return a person to a people. Above the cane fields, society stacked itself like a precarious pyramid. At the top were the Grands Blancs, great planters and merchants who thought in cargoes and interest rates, who sat on colonial councils and wrote long letters to Paris about taxes and autonomy. Below them stood the Petits Blancs, poor or middling whites, artisans, shopkeepers, overseers, who owned little more than their skin color and the status it carried. They manned militia posts, resented rich whites, arrogance, and guarded racial privileges with a zeal sharpened by insecurity. Between those two white worlds and the mass of the enslaved stood the colony's most complicated class, the free people of color, the gens de couleur libres. Many were of mixed ancestry, some were black. They could be sailors, carpenters, tailors, market women, and also planters, merchants, and slaveholders themselves. In the South and West, a coffee boom had created a cohort of successful free proprietors who built stone houses and counted their own workers at sunrise. Several served in colonial militias and fought for France in earlier wars. Yet from the 1760s onward, the law books thickened with petty humiliations designed to mark them as lesser. Bans on wearing certain fabrics, on carrying swords, on sitting beside whites in church. Restrictions on public office, and increasingly, on legal claims to equality they could once make with coin and uniform. If their success proved ability, their treatment proved the primacy of whiteness in a world built to defend it. Ports did more than float wealth. They floated ideas. Smugglers brought in American flour during wartime and copies of Parisian newspapers in peace. Sailors told stories of a revolution in France where citizens swore all men were equal and kings negotiated with crowds. In Cap Francaise and Port-au-Prince, clubs formed, planters meeting under the sign of the Club Massiac to protect their interests. Across the ocean, the Société des Amis des Noirs, Friends of the Blacks, argued in print that slavery mocked the new gospel of liberty. Free men of color in Paris, especially members of the affranchi elite like Julian Raymond, petitioned. If the rights of man meant anything, they must mean civic equality for free men of color. Those petitions came with numbers and property registers attached. They also came with the fear of petits blancs who heard in such claims the possible erasure of the one thing they owned. On the plantations, the news traveled differently, through a house servant who overheard a conversation, through a boatman who unloaded barrels and gossip at the same wharf, through a man who could read a few lines of French aloud by candlelight. People learned to hear meanings in words that were not addressed to them: rights, citizen, abolition. Some heard that the king had freed them, only to have masters declare it a misreading. Others knew no such decree existed and understood perfectly that freedom, like sugar, would have to be made with their own hands. Economics kept the colony tense even when politics did not. The cane market could soar and crash with a hurricane or a rumor of peace in Europe. Coffee prices rose on a frost in Brazil and fell when ships arrived in convoy. Slaves were capital that could resist. Mills were machines that had to run. In 1770, an earthquake rattled the West. In the 1780s, hard years tightened belts. Planters leveraged futures and swallowed debt. In the South, the success of free proprietors of color, on coffee estates where labor regimens relied less on mill time than on hoes, made their white neighbors' resentments even sharper. Laws circled tighter. Dignities shrank. The colonial government, representatives of the crown, appellate councils, and administrators, tried to keep order with ordinances backed by militia. They did not control the sea or the news that rode it. In 1789, the French Revolution tore the mother country's political map. When Paris declared the rights of man and citizen, it also declared a fight among its own factions: the National Assembly against the court, Jacobins against Girondins, clubs against clubs. In Saint Domingue, planters seized the language of rights to demand colonial autonomy while insisting slavery remain untouched. Free people of color held up the same declaration and argued, more simply, equal civil and political rights for free men regardless of color. The enslaved watched and listened. The very grammar of rights was a crack through which light leaked. In 1790, a free man of color named Vincent Aguet, recently returned from Paris, led an armed petition for those rights near Cap Francaise. It was small and it was crushed. Aguet was broken on the wheel in the public square, a medieval punishment staged in the Age of Rights. The spectacle was meant to warn. It also taught a lesson that leaders rarely intend. Compromise would not be given, it would have to be forced. By then the colony was a tinderbox stacked with 3 different inflammables: white factionalism, the claims of free people of color, and the daily brutality that sustained the sugar engine. The enslaved majority outnumbered whites and free people of color combined many times over. They knew the land better than any council could map. They had stored up grief and names to be spoken aloud when grief became rage. They also had leaders. Drivers who knew how to organize work could organize something else. Priests and priestesses who knew the spirits also knew how to call a crowd. Veterans of West African wars who had been dragged across the Atlantic still remembered how to use a blade. On the North Plain, the mountains looked down on Cane like watchmen. In August 1791, rumor and message wound through those hills like smoke. A great meeting was planned, an oath to be sworn, a storm to be called. Some called the place Bois Caïman. Witnesses later disagreed on the exact words and order, as people always do when they stand near a moment that will make history. What the masters saw, soon enough, were flames walking from estate to estate and men who had been counted as property moving as soldiers. Before that fire was lit, though, the colony had already built the match and stacked the wood. Saint Domingue in 1790, one was a world of sugar and ledgers, of whips and drums, of laws written in Paris and enforced in Cane, waiting, like all such worlds do, for the night when the ruled refused the grammar of their rulers. The Revolution's first blow would fall in those fields, but its origin lived here, in the long days of labor and the long nights of plotting, in the blurred lines bet. In 1789, a new vocabulary blew across the Atlantic: citizen, rights, nation, words light as paper and heavy enough to crack empires. In Paris, men in coats argued beneath frescoed ceilings and swore oaths on a tennis court. In Saint Domingue, overseers counted cane stalks, drivers counted lashes, and free people of color counted the ways law could lift them or pin them down. The news from France didn't arrive as a sermon. It arrived as rumors, pamphlets, tavern talk, and letters that took months to cross the sea. But it was enough. Every group on the island heard what it wanted in the echo. Grands Blancs, the great planters and merchants, heard a chance to throw off some of Paris's restraints while keeping the one restraint they needed most: slavery. Petits Blancs, the poorer whites, heard promises of equality among citizens, which they understood to mean all white men, not men of any color. Free people of color, many prosperous coffee planters, artisans, and militia officers, heard a door creak open. In 1790 and early 1791, they petitioned. If the rights of man had any meaning, civic equality must extend to free men regardless of color. In Paris, deputies wavered, torn between principle and colonial lobbying. The colony felt the strain before Paris could make up its mind. Vincent Aguet, a free man of color who had argued his case in France, returned to the north in late 1790 with a small force, more petition than army. He called on the whites of Cap Franchise to respect the rights of free citizens of color. The whites answered with militia and cannon. Aguet's band dispersed. He and his lieutenant were captured, tortured, and broken on the wheel in February 1791. The message was plain. No rights would be conceded voluntarily. But the spectacle sent a different lesson through cane rows and coffee groves. The men who spoke softly in salons were ready to break bones in public squares. In May 1791, the National Assembly passed a narrow decree: political rights for free men of color born of free parents. Planters in Saint Domingue saw not a compromise but a knife. Colonial assemblies refused to register the decree. Petits Blancs rioted against it. In ports and parishes, the argument turned into street fights, then into sieges between municipalities. White unity, always a fiction, was now a farce acted with muskets. The enslaved watched white men call each other tyrants and wrote their own conclusions. In the humid North Plain outside Cap Franchise, drivers whispered to trusted men. Messengers walked paths no map showed. A night was chosen. The memory has a name: Bois Caïman. What exactly happened is clouded by time and fear. French officials later turned it into a demon Sabbath. Survivors remembered it as an oath in the rain. But witnesses agree on the elements: a gathering in the hills, drums in the dark, a sacrifice and a vow. Duddy Bouckman, a commandeur with the bearing of a priest, is said to have prayed in a voice that could cut Cane. The God who sees from the clouds orders vengeance. Throw away the image of the master's God who asks for your tears. What mattered was not the words on the page, but the words in men's mouths as they returned to their quarters. Now, on the night of August 21-22, 1791, the fire walked. Cane fields lit like powder, mills exploded into sparks, plantation houses became torches that wrote names on the sky. men who had labored all their lives as things moved as soldiers. They carried machetes, pikes, and stolen muskets. They used the only clock they had ever owned, the overseer's, to find him in his bed. On some estates, drivers spared a kinder master or a nurse who had bent rules. On others, the rage of centuries burned without selectivity. By dawn, smoke lay on the north like a lid. By week's end, hundreds of plantations were ash, thousands of whites were dead or fleeing to Cap Franchise, and tens of thousands of enslaved people were free in the only way freedom can come at first, by force. Governor Blanchelin tried to reassert order with proclamations and columns. Militia and regulars marched out of Cap Franchise. Swiss mercenaries and artillery rolled down the roads between sugar fields. They found not a riot but an army without uniforms. Rebels struck and vanished, cut bridges, watched for flanks, and learned quickly that fire is a weapon and fear a better one. Two leaders emerged in the north, Jean-François Papillon and Georges Biassou, men who could stamp order onto chaos and put soldiers into ranks. They fought under a banner of the king, meaning the French king, whose quarrel with planters they saw as a lever they could push. In the confusion of loyalties that followed, royalist and republican meant something different at the edge of a cane field than it did in a Paris club. The revolt was not only north. Along the west and in the Artibonite, enslaved bands rose later and more unevenly, feeling their way from plantation ambushes to column warfare. In the south, where free proprietors of color were many and powerful, a different fire took. There the gens de couleur libres organized militarily for their civil rights against white municipal councils that would not recognize them. The colony was becoming not one war but three, whites against whites for political control, free people of color against whites for equality, and the enslaved against slavery itself. Lines crossed and blurred. Somewhere in that tangle a coachman named Toussaint Louverture, later called Louverture, watched, waited, and chose. Cap Franchise, the Paris of the Antilles, turned into a hospital and an armed camp. Refugees packed keys. Ships in the roadstead loaded families like cargoes and slipped away toward Charleston, Philadelphia, Santiago, Havana. Inside the city, planters demanded an iron hand, shopkeepers demanded protection, and municipal officers demanded Paris pick a side and soon. The side Paris picked, vacillating, partial, afraid of losing the colony and of losing its soul, was not enough to smother the fire. In the cane fields, the insurgents learned the cost of visibility. In November 1791, colonial forces surprised Bouqueman's camp. He fell in battle. Authorities cut off his head and stuck it on a pike in Cap Franchise to prove that the sorcerer was mortal. The symbol mattered less than the fact. The uprising no longer needed one throat to speak it. The logic of cane and chain had been reversed across a province. Estates that had measured time and harvests measured it now in centuries and ammunition. Granite facts also cut the insurgent side. Many rebels had only machetes and pikes. Victory against stone walls and cannon would require muskets, powder, and training. In the north, Jean-François and Biassou found a patron across the border. The Spanish authorities in Santo Domingo, at war with the French Republic after 1793, but already scheming to weaken the French colony before. They offered arms and commissions to men who would fight under Spain's flag. The politics of Europe had entered. The enslaved had dragged them in by the hair. In early 1792, Paris tried a different instrument, commissioners with troops and a mandate to reconcile. They arrived with compromised courage and too few bayonets. By the spring, the colony's racial civil war exploded again. White planters in the west and south defied every decree. Free men of color mobilized again to enforce the equality that paper had promised and white councils had denied. The enslaved insurgents in the north watched while whites and free people of color bled each other. In August 1792, a new set of civil commissioners, including Leger Félicité Sonthonax, landed with more soldiers and a harder resolve. Their orders were to quell rebellion and preserve the colony for France. Sonthonax would learn that these aims could not both be served unless the meaning of France changed. The violence had closed a trap on colonial logic. You cannot preach rights and keep a human being as property without creating a contradiction shaped like a blade. Planters found themselves too weak to force obedience, yet too proud to pay the price of survival, equality for free men of color and some political allegiance to the revolution. Petits Blancs preferred a ruined colony to a mixed polity. The enslaved, whose labor had bought every stone in Cap Franchise, had taken the initiative. They burned what their hands had built and filled the night with drums that said, "We are not things." The first year of war hardened men into leaders. In the north, Jean-François and Biassou signed letters with titles given by Spain. They wore sashes and drilled troops. Somewhere in that period Toussaint stepped from advisor to commander, a man who could write a letter in elegant French and plan a march in ruthless simplicity. He escorted fugitives, negotiated with priests, and learned quick what took generals years: to feed men, to keep them from desertion, to use a road like a weapon. He would soon step onto a stage that had been built by flames. Meanwhile the plantations bled. Some estates became fortresses, others became graveyards. The economy that had made Saint Domingue the richest colony in the world began to die in its cradle. Cane will grow again after fire. Capital burned slower. Paris's merchants read cargo lists shrink and imagined a West Indies remade by principle. Many feared it more than bankruptcy. In 1791-92, the enslaved of the North made their answer to Europe. Liberty, not a reform, was the demand. Negotiations with colonial officers produced amnesties, paroles, and promises that often dissolved by sunrise. The insurgents learned the shape of French words in the mouth of a man who still owned a whip. By mid-1792, the colony was a battlefield neither side could quit. The enslaved had won the North outside the towns. Whites and free people of color fought viciously for municipal power in West and South. Cap Franchise survived by sea. Spain watched like a hawk. Britain looked over the wall or made its own schools. In the north of Saint Domingue, the men who had cut cane learned to cut roads and lines of supply. The drivers, commanding rows by whistle, learned to command platoons by drum. In the early campaigns after the August Rising, one figure moved through camps with a quiet authority, a coachman from the Breda plantation known as Toussaint. He knew horses, routes, and the habits of men. He wrote letters in French that unnerved colonial officers by their clarity, and he spoke Creole like a bell. He had a healer's bag and a soldier's eye, and he was patient. Paris sent commissioners to save the colony for the Republic. Later Félicité Sonthonax and Etienne Polverel arrived in 1792 with troops and an impossible brief: restore order, keep the planters from jumping to counter-revolution, reconcile with free men of color now legally citizens, and somehow keep the enslaved insurgency from consuming everything. The colony pressed them flat. White municipalities refused to register decrees granting the vote to free men of color. Petits Blancs and Grands Blancs shot at each other from behind barricades. The British sniffed opportunity from Jamaica. Spain squeezed from Santo Domingo. In June 1793, Cap Franchise tore itself open. Governor Galbaud, a white royalist appointed by Paris, turned his sailors and a portion of the garrison against the commissioners. Street fighting ripped the Paris of the Antilles. Sonthonax armed free men of color. He armed, in desperation and in logic, black insurgents who would fight for the city. Fires lit sky and sea. The harbor filled with refugees. Warehouses exploded. A taste of civil war's final course, ash. Sonthonax could read the ledger. If France wanted to keep anything in Saint Domingue, property and man had to be struck from the account. In late June 1793, he proclaimed the emancipation of the enslaved in the North. Polverel would follow in the West and South, couching it as a republican necessity. It was not yet Paris's law. It was survival, declared on soil where the old law could no longer be enforced. The words mattered, and where words had been counterfeits, they had to be stamped with action. Muskets, ranks, rations, uniforms, citizens made, not promised. Toussaint did not move at any man's first trumpet. At that moment, he was nominally allied with Spain, whose commanders in Santo Domingo offered arms and rank to any rebel willing to fight against the French Republic. The logic ran as clear as a mountain stream. Spain was at war with revolutionary France. Rebels needed powder and a flag. The king was a banner enslaved men knew their enemies respected. Under Spanish commission, Jean-François and Biassou styled themselves generals. Their bands became columns with drums and sashes. Toussaint, already calling himself Louverture, the opening, after slipping through a French encirclement to seize a gap, organized a force around discipline rather than loot. He forbade pillage, punished rape, and insisted that civilians and prisoners be protected when protection did not cost victory. Soldiers who had known only brutality learned something unnerving. A commander who demanded respect gave it, too. Across the river of politics the Republic churned. In Paris, the convention watched a map of fronts and a ledger of casualties. On 4 February 1794, 16 Pluvias year II, the French National Convention did what no European power had done. It abolished slavery in all French colonies. The decree was both principle and calculus. It answered the old contradiction of liberty, laced through a slave empire, and it offered a deal to black armies that controlled most of Saint Domingue's hinterland. Fight under the tricolor. Be citizens. The words crossed the ocean folded in dispatches and unfolded at musters with tears and musket salutes. A revolution had finally recognized a revolution. Toussaint read the decree, the weather, and the men in front of him. Spain had been a tool. Emancipation had always been the aim. In the spring of 1794, he pivoted with a precision generals study and biographers called destiny. He broke with Spain, declared for France, and brought with him thousands of hardened soldiers who had learned in 2 years the geometry of ambush and the mathematics of supply. The tricolor rose in camps that had once flown the banner of the Spanish king. Spanish officers fumed, British agents cursed, French Republicans exhaled for the first time in months. The greatest commander the island would produce had chosen the side whose proclamations matched his army's reason for being. Switches of allegiance are judged by their fruits. The fruits came quickly. Toussaint's columns moved like whetted blades, driving Spanish garrisons from posts on the northern frontier and pushing royalist whites into exile. He wrote to rival insurgent leaders, Jean-François and Biassou, with courtesy and steel, offering rank to those who could accept it and war to those who could not. He wrote to parish priests to keep churches open. He wrote to planters who had not fled promising protection if they accepted the new order. He wrote to commissioners demanding supplies and chiding them for dithering. Every letter had 2 purposes, the literal purpose on the page and the larger work of depicting himself, to friend and foe, as the indispensable man. He also built an army out of more than rage. Training made the difference. Officers who could barely sign their names learned how to align files by the sun and wheel companies on a hilltop under fire. Blacksmiths turned out bayonet sockets by the bushel. Tailors converted tricolor cockades into symbols that meant something beyond France. Liberty wearing a hat one could spot in smoke. Toussaint made a habit of climbing into the saddle before dawn to ride positions that other commanders would have left to aides. He wanted men to see his face, and to know that the orders arrived from a throat that had eaten the same dust they did. The French governor in the north, Etienne Louverture, recognized what stood in front of him. He promoted Toussaint to brigadier, then to general of division, insignia sewn on a uniform that had been, months earlier, the enemy. The 2 men depended on each other, Louverture for a fighting force that answered to him in law if not in fact, Toussaint for the legal cloak under which he could gather power in the name of France. In 1794-95, they tightened control over the north, taking posts one by one, reopening workshops, and trying a species of miracle, restarting production without slavery. Here the revolution discovered its hardest paradox. Liberty had freed bodies. Hunger and war did not free bellies. Sugar and coffee could be burned. they could less easily be eaten. Toussaint's answer in these early years was a labor regime that looked, to many freed people, like the old one stripped of chains and dressed in tricolor. Plantations, now often managed by the state or by returned proprietors under protection, were ordered back into production. Freed men and women were bound by obligations to estates. Military officers doubled as agricultural overseers. Desertion from fields could be punished as desertion from the ranks. Wages existed, whips were banned, but compulsion remained. It would sit in Haiti's soul for decades, the cost of survival presented as duty. For now, in 1794, most freed families were still moving between camps and the charred footprints of old estates. Survival had a uniform and a ration. War did not pause for economics to find its conscience. The British moved in 1793 to seize the colony piecemeal. Mole St. Nicholas in the northwest, Jérémie in the south, ports along the western coast. They arrived with ready cash for planters willing to hoist Union Jacks and promises to restore order. That meant the old labor system wearing a new flag. Toussaint could not fight everyone at once in 1794. That would come later. But his allegiance shift deprived the British of the simplest narrative, that the Republic had no black allies and no legitimacy. He beat back Spanish columns, then turned west to probe British positions, feeling for weaknesses he would later break. Meanwhile, free men of color, now French citizens-in-law, fought under their own chiefs in the south and west. André Rigaud, the polished mulatto general and coffee magnate, commanded disciplined troops around Les Quais and Jacmel. For the moment, he and Toussaint were both pillars of the same edifice, a French Saint Domingue without slavery, defended by armies that had not existed a year beforehand. Beneath the cooperation lay fault lines, region, class, color, that would open later. In 1794, they were bridges. Toussaint moved like a man who knew bridges could collapse. He courted foreign protection before he needed it, trading letters with British and American merchants who wanted sugar and coffee more than they wanted abstractions. He sent emissaries to the U.S. commander at sea. He invited neutral ship captains to test the ports he controlled. The Americans, at odds with revolutionary France but increasingly friendly to Toussaint's anti-British stance, would soon deal with him directly. He was not yet the island's ruler. He was already its diplomat. At campfires his soldiers gave him a surname that sounded like a prophecy. Louverture, the opening, was explained later with a wink. He found the opening in the enemy line at La Tannerie and walked through it. The name also fit his habit of finding the hinge in a situation and leaning on it until the door moved. Spain had been a hinge, emancipation was another, the rivalry among white factions another, Britain's overreach another still. A man taught to wait with a carriage on a slope, until the break held had carried that lesson into a revolution rolling downhill. By the end of 1794, the map of the North had changed its colors. Spanish garrisons had retreated, royalist whites had fled or bent, French commissioners, stiff-wit. When Toussaint Louverture turned his army to the tricolor in 1794, he did not inherit peace. He inherited a battlefield with three horizons, Spain on the frontier, Britain on the coast, and beneath both, a society that had to be rebuilt without the chains that once held it together. He would fight, negotiate, and farm, often on the same day. Spain was the first hinge to move. The Treaty of Basel, 1795, ended Spain's war with the French Republic and, on paper, ceded the eastern colony of Santo Domingo to France. On the ground, Spanish officers still held their posts and supplied royalists who slashed at the border. Toussaint used the new peace like a pry bar, pressing Spanish garrisons with columns that moved fast and foraged light, taking posts, and rolling the frontier west to east until the old line became a rumor. The black troops who a year earlier had worn Spanish sashes now took Spanish forts for France. Britain proved gaudier and deadlier. From Jamaica, British generals had come in 1793 with a simple pitch to planters: hoist the Union Jack, keep your slaves, and we'll bring order. They captured Mole St. Nicholas, Jérémie, and a necklace of western ports. They bled for everyone. Yellow fever, the Emperor of the Antilles, sat on their camps and exacted a tax no budget had priced. The British lost tens of thousands in 2 years, more to fever than to musketry. Still they hung on, hopping to carve a British Saint Domingue from the Republic's wreckage. Toussaint did not let fever do all the work. In the north and Artibonite he fought a war of posts and rivers, seized Gonaives, cut the line to St. Mark, break a British bridgehead with a night attack that started with drums and ended with bayonets. His soldiers learned to use cane fields as walls and irrigation ditches as trenches, to carry ladders for both walls and flooded culverts, and to move always before dawn. Opposite them, British columns, heavy with red coats and European drill, found themselves charging villages that grew into fortresses by dusk. He also fought a political war. In February 1796, white planters in Cap Francaise tried to arrest Governor Etienne Lavoux and roll back the clock by force. Toussaint marched the 14 leagues to Cap in a day, the road shuddering under hooves and drums. He freed Lavoux, and the governor, understanding debts and destiny, named him lieutenant governor and commander-in-chief of Saint Domingue. Lavoux soon sailed for France. The colony had a new center of gravity. Not everyone accepted it. In late 1796, the Commissioner Sonthonax returned from France to reassert civil authority. Toussaint treated him with respect and then quietly removed him. In 1797, he engineered Sonthonax's departure by election and by the fact that ships are easy places to send political rivals. "I am the only man fit to govern this colony," he told a French agent, half boast, half weather report. Paris sent another commissioner, Hédouville, in 1798, who tried to play Toussaint and André Rigaud, the powerful free-colored general in the south, against each other. Hédouville fled the island when the game went wrong. Toussaint took note. France would send paper and intrigues. He would answer with ports and grain. Against Britain, he learned the power of a handshake. By 1798, his columns had boxed British garrisons into a few positions. General Thomas Maitland, a practical man and a sepulchre of theory, sat down with him. They made a deal. The British would evacuate their last holdings, including Mole St. Nicholas. Toussaint would guarantee safe passage, and trade between Saint Domingue and British Jamaica would quietly resume. The treaty's ink dried in a room with no fanfare, and British ships sailed away from a coast that had eaten an army. A Haitian leader and a British general shook hands over the wreckage of empire. Each had gotten what he needed most. Across the water, the United States ran a separate quarrel with France, the quays a war at sea, and discovered in Toussaint a useful partner. American merchants wanted sugar and coffee. Toussaint wanted flour, salt cod, gunpowder, and a navy that would look past flags and protect commerce. In 1799, the Adams administration opened American ports to trade with Toussaint Saint Domingue, and U.S. warships in the Caribbean found themselves, in effect, shielding his commerce while intercepting French privateers loyal to whatever Paris claimed this week. Letters traveled between Louverture and the Secretary of State, Timothy Pickering. He signed them with a flourish and an argument. Saint Domingue would be loyal to France as long as France remained loyal to emancipation. Meanwhile, he tried to do something the 18th century did not think possible: restart a plantation economy without slavery. His agrarian military regime tied freed families to estates, now under state protection or managed by returning proprietors on strict terms, paid wages in a share of the crop, and punished desertion from fields as desertion from ranks. Officers became agricultural supervisors with epaulets. Vagrancy meant a lecture, a job, or jail. It was compulsion wrapped in citizenship, and it kept cane grinding and ports loading. Exports rose again, so did resentment. A man told to report to the field whistle now heard, sometimes, the echo of the old whip. With Spain sidelined and Britain gone, the next war opened from within. The south of the colony, Grand Anse les Quais Jacmel, was the realm of General André Rigaud, a polished mulatto officer, coffee magnate, and sponsor of a disciplined army of free men of color. Rigaud's region had suffered less destruction. His estates ran well. His officers wore sashes as much as scars. He and Toussaint had worked as allies under the French flag, but their differences, region, class, and the tightening rivalry introduced by Hauteville, became a crack. In 1799, the crack split. Haitians would remember the conflict as the War of Knives. It was not a polite civil war. Rigaud struck first, seizing the strategic port of Jacmel and pushing north toward Léogane and Petit-Gove. Toussaint answered by assigning his harshest battering ram, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, to the southern front, while Henry Christophe pressed on the coast. The campaign spiraled into sieges and reprisals. Dessalines burned and took and burned, and every village in the path learned his name. In letters, Toussaint urged restraint. In orders, he demanded victory. At sea, the war's logic reversed. The United States Navy and Royal Navy, which had recently protected Rigaud's trade, now tilted toward Toussaint. In the quays, Americans targeted French privateers operating from southern ports. The British preferred dealing with the man who had evacuated their garrisons and would keep commerce flowing. Jacmel, blockaded, starved. Inside, Rigaud's men boiled leather and scraped barrels. Outside, Dessalines' men tightened the ring and prayed for wind to hold American frigates on station. In March 1800, Jacmel fell. By summer, one southern town after another came under Toussaint's tricolor. Rigaud, ever elegant, negotiated his departure and sailed into exile. The War of Knives ended not with a treaty but with a map, north, west, and south under one command. Unity came with a cost. The fighting had left scars that would not fade, especially on the color line. Many in the South saw in Dessalines' harshness a vendetta of blacks against mulattoes. Many in the North saw in Rigaud's initial ambition a return to planter hierarchies with new faces. Toussaint swore loyalty to France and equality to all free citizens. He also made brutal examples when rebellion simmered. In the North, his own nephew, Maes, beloved by rural soldiers and impatient with plantation discipline, was executed in 1801 after a mutiny. Toussaint wanted a country of law. He would not let family rewrite it. Yet even in war, he kept the diplomat's pen moving. With British General Maitland, he set border understandings. With the Americans, he wrote about commerce as if it were a treaty of peace. With planters in the United States and France, he made a familiar pitch. Return to your estates, accept emancipation and my authority, and we will protect you and your property in land and mills, not in people. Some returned. Some refused. All learned that the colony they called Saint Domingue was being remade by a man who could walk from a staff conference into a boiling house and ask whether the third pan was drawing too slowly. By 1799, two truths were clear to every captain from Cap Francaise to Port-au-Prince. First, the British were gone because Toussaint and yellow fever had made calcified empire impossible. Second, the man in the blue coat with the calm voice was, in effect if not yet in law, the governor of the richest piece of France's overseas estate. He spoke of the Republic, demanded its banners fly, and insisted the Emancipation Decree of 1794 was the one article no commissioner could amend. Paris could write what it liked. Saint Domingue would read any letter against that line. The news from Europe, meanwhile, darkened. In 1799, a Corsican general named Bonaparte returned from Egypt, threw the Directory out of its chairs, and proclaimed a consulate. Saint Domingue's indent in his map was a large one, France's most valuable colony, its sugar back on the register, run by a general who pledged loyalty to France and independence for black citizens in the same sentence. Bonaparte wanted revenues, order, and, though he did not yet declare it, the restoration of slavery where he could manage it. He sent friendly words and agents with sharp ears. Toussaint replied with sugar and perfect politeness. He also began to write a law that would lock his principles in place. In the North, he ordered assemblies to draft regulations for the good of the colony. He described the colony's future in sentences that sounded like marches. Property would be respected. Agriculture. By 1800, the island that had burned like a funeral pyre was exporting again. Canoes and brigs slid into Cap Francaise under a forest of masts. Coffee sacks and sugar hogsheads swung from dockside cranes. Clerks scratched sums in ledgers where, a year earlier, ash had blown through shattered windows. The man who had made this possible, Toussaint Louverture, stood at the center of a web he had tied himself. Soldiers turned district administrators, priests coaxed back to parish altars, American and British merchants welcomed with contracts, French flags raised over forts by a governor who insisted he was a loyal son of the Republic, and in the same breath, master of its most valuable colony. The next step was to turn habit into law. Toussaint understood that guns win territory and rules keep it. In early 1801, he summoned assemblies from the colony's departments to draft a special statute for Saint Domingue. Commissaires and jurists debated in rooms where the air still smelled of molasses and ink. The draft they produced, shaped by Toussaint's circulars and carried down the stair in his own hand, defined a world that did not yet have a name, loyal to France but self-governing in everything that mattered. On 8 July 1801, the Constitution of Saint Domingue was proclaimed. It began with a sentence that both acknowledged and defied the metropole. Saint Domingue in its entire expanse is part of the French Empire. It is subject to the same laws. Then came the word that made that sentence an argument: special. The colony would be governed by special laws suited to its climate, people, and needs. At the heart of those special laws were the guarantees that had brought black armies under the tricolor and kept them there. Slavery was abolished forever. All men born and domiciled in the colony were French and equal before the law, regardless of color. There would be no distinctions other than virtue and talent. The Catholic religion, long the empire's varnish and the enslaved people's language of burial and blessing, was declared the sole public religion, though private worship was tolerated, and Toussaint invited clergy to take up empty pulpits. Sunday would be a day of rest and mass order marched with piety. The Constitution also named a governor. It did not pretend uncertainty. Toussaint Louverture was confirmed as governor for life, with the power to name his successor subject, on paper, to approval by the central government in France. He held the power to make appointments, direct the army, oversee foreign commerce, and promulgate regulations between sessions of the colonial assembly. In the articles, one could hear both a soldier's impatience for clarity and a planter's appetite for control, delegated, but always on a short leash. Property, badly defined in a world where people had been property, received guarantees designed to reassure French proprietors abroad and to tether freed people to estates at home. Land and buildings were inviolable. Confiscations would require law and compensation. Émigrés who returned and accepted the new order could recover their plantations, minus those already redistributed, under the protection of the state. But the old plantation rhythm would continue in a new key. The Constitution authorized the executive to set regulations of culture to ensure that agriculture, the colony's vein of gold, did not wither. Those regulations were the labor code Toussaint had already been improvising in orders and discipline. Plantations became habitations worked by crews of free laborers enrolled by the state. Military officers doubled as rural administrators and police. Passes controlled movement. Desertion from the fields could be punished like desertion from the ranks. Workers were to be paid wages, a third of the product, in theory, housed, clothed, and subject to no corporal punishment. In practice, the line between discipline and coercion blurred in the dust of a road where a rural guard carried a musket and a list of names. For Toussaint, the choice was not between compulsion and liberty. It was between disorder that would invite an enemy and order that might hold him at the shore. To many in the countryside, men and women who had earned freedom with fire and blood, those distinctions mattered less than a simple truth. They were still being told where to stand when the whistle blew. Even as the Constitution took shape, Toussaint moved to settle the island's other, older question: sovereignty over the East. The Treaty of Basel, 1795, had ceded Spanish Santo Domingo to France, but Spain had never truly handed over the keys. In January 1801, before the ink dried on his statute, Toussaint marched east with Christophe and Dessalines. Towns opened their gates. Spanish officials bargained for dignified exits. Black and mixed-race militias formed around new commanders. The French tricolor supplanted the Bourbon flag on the Azama. In Santo Domingo City, Toussaint proclaimed what the treaty and his conscience required. Slavery was abolished there as well. Church bells rang for the Mass. Drums spoke in Creole and Spanish. For the first time, the whole of Hispaniola belonged to a regime that had written no slavery into law. With the East pacified, Toussaint returned to what he considered the harder work, binding a society that did not agree about what it had become. To white returning planters, he offered protection, contracts, and the recovery of property they could physically manage, if they bent their necks to the abolition they had once tried to strangle. To free people of color, especially the Southern elite shaken by the War of Knives, he offered rank, posts, and portraits of reconciliation. To the black majority, he offered land leases in some districts, wages in others, and a thin promise that children would have schools and shoes where their parents had none. He made examples where words failed. In the North, the most painful was the case of Maïs, Toussaint's young nephew and popular general, beloved by rural soldiers for his sympathy with their demand for small plots and their hatred of plantation discipline. In September 1801, after an uprising in the North Plains that mixed local grievances and broader resistance to the labor code, Maïs's complicity, more tolerance than leadership, more negligence than plot, gave Toussaint his chance to draw a line. A tribunal condemned Maïs. He was executed by firing squad in the public square at Cap. The message was intestinal. No one, not blood nor popularity, would be allowed to turn the army of emancipation into an army of peasant independence that would leave mills silent and forts unpaid. If the Constitution had been the inside voice, commerce was the outside voice. Toussaint signed agreements that made the ports hum. With the British erstwhile invaders turned trading partners, he kept up a quiet, pragmatic détente. With the United States, he turned letters into manifests. The Adams administration had flung American markets open to Saint Domingue. Jefferson, elected in 1800 and wary of France, yet wary of a black republic's example, trimmed sails but did not cut all lines. American flour, salt fish, and barrels kept workshops and kitchens moving. Coffee and sugar kept creditors in Boston and Philadelphia, cheering a revolution they would not have touched if it had happened in Virginia. All of this looked from Paris, like audacity bordering on secession. Napoleon Bonaparte, first consul, fresh from rearranging Europe, read the 1801 Constitution with a scowl and a calculation. He had already decided to restore slavery in those French colonies, where it had not been abolished by insurgent force. Guadeloupe would learn this in 1802, and he had dreams of a Caribbean empire sketched in sugar and drawn through the isthmus of a restored French Louisiana. A colony that declared emancipation forever, welcomed British and American ships, and named its own governor for life was, in his mind, a colony that needed a firmer hand. He wrote to Toussaint with courtesy and thunder. Submit the Constitution for approval, await commissioners, obey the metropolis. Toussaint answered with perfect politeness and a reality that no letter could erase. The law you object to is the only law that keeps the island French. In Cap Franchise, copies of the Constitution were read on church steps. In Port Républicain, the renamed Port-au-Prince, officers pinned tricolor cockades to coats made from captured cloth and homespun ambitions. In Jacmel, the southern harbor whose blockade had broken Rigaud, merchants did arithmetic and smiled. On the Dominican side, a priest who had baptized slaves before a whip now baptized free children whose parents still had to show passes at the road. The regime's contradictions were visible to everyone. They were also, for the moment, survivable. Only one thing could end the experiment quickly: a metropolitan expedition with more men than fever could kill. In the autumn of 1801, rumors multiplied. Ships on French slips at Brest and Rochefort, Swiss mercenaries hired into regiments bound for the tropics, Napoleon's brother-in-law, General Charles Leclerc, chosen to command. Toussaint took the rumors as fact. He reorganized departments under his two iron hands, Henry Christophe in the north, Jean-Jacques Dessalines in the west and south, and issued standing orders that read like a cold prayer. If a French fleet appears, parley. If commissioners demand your disarmament, refuse. If troops attempt to land, burn the ports, retreat into the interior, and make the mountains tariff collectors of blood. Yet he still wrote to Paris as if words could do what batteries could not. He mailed copies of the Constitution. He repeated the mantra that saved the tricolor in 1794. You cannot keep Saint Domingue without emancipation, and only the army that won emancipation can keep order. In another world, a first consul who prized revenues over pride might have signed on to tea. In February 1802, the horizon whitened with sails. A French armada, more ships than the roadstead at Cap Francaise had ever held, stood off the coast under the command of General Charles Victor Leclerc, Napoleon Bonaparte's brother-in-law. On deck were veteran regiments, Swiss auxiliaries, artillery, engineers, and orders. Leclerc's letters to Toussaint Louverture spoke the language of courtesy and obedience. France sends forces to re-establish authority, to punish usurpers, to preserve emancipation, and to keep the colony in the embrace of the Republic. Between the lines lay the truth. Paris would not tolerate a black governor for life, or a constitution written in cap and sent to Paris for approval after the fact. Leclerc split his fleet and his plan. One squadron anchored off Cap Francaise in the north, another off Port Républicain Port-au-Prince in the west, a third in the south. He rode ahead inviting commanders to submit. Henry Christophe held the north for Toussaint. He read Leclerc's demand, looked at the sea, and chose the one thing that would deny a landing force its prize. He put the torch to Cap Francaise and withdrew inland. Smoke climbed into the trade winds. Storehouses and mansions cracked in the heat. Refugees jammed the roads. Along the western shore, General Boudet forced a landing near Port Républicain. In the south, Donatien de Rochambeau put troops ashore with the brutality that would later make his name a curse. French moved fast. The country answered with stone. At the western hinge of the island, on a rocky height above the Artibonite called La Crère de Piret, Jean-Jacques Dessalines threw up a fort and loaded it with powder, men, and oaths. Lamartinière, young, grim, and gifted with cannon, commanded the guns. French columns converged from three directions. Blue coats filled ravines. Batteries barked at dawn and dusk. Inside the fort, water ran low. Rations ran out. Men gave their last drink to gun sponges. When the breach came and Leclerc's infantry surged, Dessalines ordered a breakout through musketry so thick it cut leaves off bushes. A corps of defenders shouldered their way out by bayonet and grit, leaving behind guns spiked and walls still smoking. The fort fell. The war did not. Leclerc shifted tactics. He tried war with open hand and closed fist. To black generals who had followed Toussaint he offered amnesties, ranks, and the fiction that nothing fundamental would change. Submit and keep your command. To those who refused he sent columns and proclamations in the same saddle bag. The offer worked for a time. Christophe bowed and accepted a French commission. Dessalines, who had fought like iron at Crère de Piret and retreated in good order, judged the odds and submitted as well. In the south and west, Alexander Pachen and other free-colored officers joined the French. André Rigaud, long Toussaint's rival, returned from exile with hopes of reclaiming the south under Paris's favor. Leclerc congratulated himself. Napoleon read dispatches with satisfaction. The usurper stood alone. Toussaint did not mistake the weather for climate. He withdrew into the mountains with a small staff and his family, harrying French patrols by night, destroying bridges by day, and writing letters that tried to pry open the seams of Leclerc's coalition. He still insisted before the world that his quarrel was not with France, but with any attempt to undo emancipation. Leclerc, having won the submission of black and mixed-race officers by promising stability, moved to remove the man who made their obedience meaningful. In June 1802, French General Brunet invited Toussaint to a parley near Gonaives under a flag of truce. The general came dressed for negotiation. He was seized, bound, and hurried to a ship in the roadstead. On the deck, as the coast slid away, he said words that history remembers because they came true. "In overthrowing me, you have cut down only the trunk of the tree of liberty in Saint Domingue. It will spring up again from the roots, for they are numerous and deep." The ship carried him to France, then to the cold stone of Fort de Joux in the Jura. There, in a cell that looked at snow, the man who had marched the island into a new century died in April 1803 of illness, isolation, and the indifference of a state that feared him in chains. The trunk had fallen. The roots were already moving. Pivot from pacification to independence came faster than Leclerc imagined, because two forces he could not command arrived at once: disease and policy. Yellow fever, Saint Domingue's oldest general, took the French army in hand. In the summer of 1802, men fell in tens, then hundreds, then thousands. Entire regiments sickened. Lamplight in tents glowed over rings of the dead. Leclerc himself wrote letters that grew darker as the fever climbed the hill to his quarters. In November he died. Donatien de Rochambeau succeeded him, bringing with the baton a program of terror fit for a hangman, not a governor. Rochambeau made clear the thing Leclerc had hinted and Toussaint had feared. The French expedition was not here to preserve emancipation. In Guadeloupe earlier that year, French troops had restored slavery in blood. Word of that betrayal had reached Saint Domingue with the speed of grief. Now Rochambeau disarmed black units, shot officers on pretexts, and unleashed drownings and hangings as policy. He imported man-hunting dogs from Cuba. He staged spectacles of execution to frighten men who had learned their courage at night in cane fields. The effect was opposite. Christophe, Dessalines, and Haitian, former foes, saw plainly that submission led to chains. They broke with the French and called their soldiers to the only cause left: independence. Allies hatched in earlier wars returned. In May 1803, Britain and France went back to general war. The Royal Navy entered Caribbean waters with blockades and a new willingness to deal with Dessalines as the sovereign power on shore. British frigates closed French ports, captured supply ships, and made every bale of biscuit a duel. Dessalines took up the siege with methods he had learned by hardship: isolate towns, cut roads, attack posts, punish collaborators, and when the French sallied, make them pay. In the west, he drove French columns out of Léogane and Petit-Gove. In the south, Haitian and Geffrard, free-colored officers who had once worn French sashes, trained artillery that found its mark. In the north, Christophe closed the ring on Cap Francaise, whose fort guns barked over an increasingly empty harbor. Revolution grew a flag. At Arcahea, in May 1803, a story Haitians still tell begins with Dessalines tearing the white from the French tricolor and asking Catherine Flan to sew the remaining blue and red together. Whatever the precise moment, by that spring the blue and red standard flew above batteries that no longer took orders from Paris. It represented not a party within the Republic, but a people outside it. The campaign's last act opened under a north wind. By November 1803, Rochambeau's army, shattered by fever, starved by blockade, and ringed by Haitian troops, held little more than the forts around Cap Francaise. He needed a victory to bargain with the British for honorable evacuation. Dessalines, knowing that every day shortened French rations and lengthened Haitian courage, marched to finish what he had begun. On 18 November, on the heights of Vertières just south of the city, the two armies tore at each other for the last time. Haitian units advanced in waves under tricolor-less banners, drums beating the same rhythms that had called work in cane and battle in night. General François Capois Lamort, rode at the head of his column into a crossfire so murderous that his horse went down from under him. He rose, brushed powder from his coat, and shouted "In avant!" forward, and his men went with him into the storm. A French cannonball took his hat. He bowed toward the French line and put it back on. For a moment the guns on both sides fell silent, as if soldiers had remembered what bravery was before they remembered what orders were. Then the field erupted again. All day long, Haitian infantry tried the heights, fell back, reformed, and tried again. Pétion's gunners found embrasures and punished them. Christophe's brigades moved like door hinges toward the right moment. By dusk the French line buckled. By night its officers knew the ring had closed. The next day negotiations began. Rochambeau, seeing no rescue on the horizon and the British fleet already measuring anchors, accepted terms. The French would evacuate Cap Francaise under British escort. They would abandon their last Caribbean dream on an island that refused to be property, province, or example of compliance. Evacuation began at once. French families crowded boats. Soldiers filed to the docks with arms meant to protect honor and perhaps a hope that a future France would remember them. Some ships sailed to Jamaica, others to Cuba, others to the United States. Many carried fever. On the shore, Dessalines watched the mast shrink and did not smile. He had been the hammer for years. Now he would have to be the architect. The trunk had fallen in the Jura. The branches had grown together in Saint Domingue into a tree no metropole could prune. Independence was no longer a slogan. It was a fact of ground and guns that needed a word. On 1 January 1804 in Gonaives, Dessalines would stand before officers and citizens and speak it aloud, Haiti, and declare a world's first, a black republic born of a slave revolt against the empires of its age. On the first morning of 1804, officers, soldiers, and notables gathered in Gonaives to hear the words they had fought a dozen years to pronounce. Jean-Jacques Dessalines stood before them, scarred from a lifetime of war, and read the Act of Independence. The old colonial name, Saint Domingue, was struck off. The country would be called Haiti, from the island's Tain, a word Haiti, mountainous land, an act that reached past Cain and conquest to something older than both. "We have dared to be free," the proclamation said. "Let us be thus by ourselves and for ourselves." Independence was not a pause between battles. It was a decision about how to survive in a world of enemies. Dessalines faced a ledger of facts, a devastated countryside, ports short of ships, neighbors who traded with him because they must and shunned him because they dared not do otherwise, planters abroad plotting return, and an army, a nation in arms, whose loyalty had to be paid in honor and bread. He moved with the speed of a man who knew wind shifts quickly. The first policy was security, and it was terrible. Convinced that the white French colonist class on the island was a permanent fifth column and a mortal threat, Dessalines ordered their elimination. In early 1804, massacres swept the towns and plains. Most French whites who had not already evacuated were killed. A small number of groups, Poles who had defected during the war, Germans who were traders, some medical and technical specialists, were spared, later echoed in the 1805 Constitution's selective exceptions. The killing secured Haiti against internal restoration and scarred its soul. Generations would argue whether necessity or vengeance had ruled those weeks. The dead, as ever, explained nothing. Dessalines also wrote law. The 1805 Constitution made independence irreversible in clauses as blunt as a musket butt. Slavery is forever abolished. All citizens are black, a political color aimed at erasing the planter's caste ladder. No white person may own land in Haiti, with narrow exceptions for sanctioned naturalizations. Catholicism remained the state religion, but religious liberty stood too. The army was the school, police, and spine of the new state. Titles and uniforms created rank for men who had once had only numbers on a slave tally. The economy was the second battlefield. Dessalines needed exports to buy powder and flour. The world, still enthralled to sugar, would not buy them without product. He kept Toussaint's military agrarian system, leasing estates as state domains, compelling field labor through the chain of command, promising wages and protection, punishing desertion and theft. Some families gained small plots, many were bound to habitations they did not own. The logic, order, or famine was merciless. The reality was exhausted people resentful of drums that again measured their days. In late 1804, Dessalines crowned himself Emperor Jacques I. Hopping a scepter would speak more clearly to hostile courts than a general's baton. In the north, he toured fortifications and began the colossal project of the Cité de la Ferrière, a mountain fortress meant to make invasion bleed out before it reached the plains. In the south and west, he watched rivals for signs of treachery. Alexander Paitian, polished and popular among the free-colored elite. Henry Christophe, iron disciplinarian and builder, second to no man in ambition and power. Abroad, the shock was mixed with silence. Britain, at war with Napoleon, treated Haiti pragmatically and traded. Spain ignored it. The United States, ruled by slaveholders terrified of a black republic's example, slammed an embargo shut and looked away except when merchants could not resist a market. France, humiliated and then preoccupied by empire and continental war, refused any recognition and waited for the island to fail or beg. The global slave economy digested the loss. Sugar shifted to Cuba and Brazil. The price of human bodies adjusted, but the idea that enslaved people could burn slavery out of a colony and keep it out could not be made to disappear. Domestic politics cracked under the weight of experiments and memories. Dessalines' severity toward laborers who wandered, officers who disobeyed, and notables who whispered, inflamed enemies. In October 1806, on the road near Pont Rouge outside Port-au-Prince, conspirators closed a ring around the emperor. He fell under bullets from men who had once cheered his charges. The state split at his death along lines etched by war and class. In the north, Henry Christophe held Cap Haitian, kept the plantation regimen with iron discipline, and in 1811 crowned himself King Henry I, building palaces at Saint Domingue and vaulting the citadel stone by stone above the clouds. In the south and west, Alexander Paitian declared a republic, introduced a senate, and crucially, distributed portions of the great estates to soldiers and peasants. The northern kingdom tried to save exports. The southern republic chose the peasant smallholding. That choice shaped a century. Christophe's corvée and drill produced impressive public works and a trickle of sugar. Paitian's parceling of land made a nation of small proprietors who grew food for themselves and coffee for market, but little sugar for export. Coffee would keep households alive and the state hungry. When Paitian died in 1818, Jean-Pierre Boyer continued his policies and, in 1822, marched east to reunify Hispaniola, abolishing slavery in Santo Domingo and holding the whole island for 22 years. The East chafed. Spanish restorationists found allies, but for a generation Haiti enforced freedom where empires hesitated to speak it. Recognition came attached to chains of a different sort. In 1825, under the threat of a French squadron offshore and the constant risk of wartime isolation, Boyer agreed to an indemnity, 150 million francs, later reduced to 90 million, to compensate former French proprietors for lost property. It was the price of formal recognition, lower tariffs, and an end to the dream of a French reconquest. Haiti paid with generations of taxes and debt, borrowing from French banks to pay France, remitting the proceeds of coffee harvests across the Atlantic, starving schools and roads to feed a ledger that called itself law. Independence had survived. Capital demanded a tithe. And yet, Haiti at once suffered and radiated. Enslaved people across the Americas learned the name and kept it in their mouths like a seed. Haiti. Proof a different ending existed. Haitian proclamations and newspapers traveled clandestinely in sailors' trunks. The rebellion in Curaçao heard an echo. Revolts in Venezuela and Colombia kindled around men who had seen black troops in Port-au-Prince drilling with pride. When Simon Bolivar failed and fled to the Caribbean in 1815, Haiti's President Paitian gave him arms, ships, and sanctuary on a simple condition: free the slaves wherever you triumph. Bolivar sailed, returned, and issued emancipation decrees as he fought. His letters back to Paitian thanked him with the humility of a man who knew debts are not always monetary. In the Atlantic world, the Haitian Revolution accelerated a moral reckoning and a market pivot. British abolitionists, armed with economic and humanitarian arguments, won Parliament's vote to end the slave trade in 1807, an achievement built by decades of work, and sharpened by a demonstration in Saint Domingue that the trade also carried strategic risk. Planters across the Americas read Haiti as a nightmare and redoubled surveillance. Abolitionists read it as a beacon and redoubled campaigns. In the United States, slaveholders organized militias and laws against insurrectionary talk. Black communities in the North celebrated Haitian independence in sermons and parades. Two visions of the future took clearer shape because a small island had refused the present. Haiti itself kept walking a ridge between survival and hope. Christophe's kingdom fell in 1820. He shot himself rather than surrender as uprisings rolled through the north. The citadel stood as an answer in stone to a question Europe kept asking. Could black power build? Haitian's republicanism evolved into long presidencies, and then into the familiar seesaw of constitutions and coups, geology for the politics of poor states caught between hostile markets and hungry neighbors. But the peasant majority, settled on hillsides, built a culture that excavated freedom from the soil. Laku family compounds, Vodou ceremonies that married saints and spirits to the calendar, convent work parties that planted and harvested in circles of song, markets thick with produce and gossip, a Creole language that made law and love intelligible to those who had possessed neither under the lash. Every gain had its shadow. Foreign powers exploited division. U.S. Marines would occupy Haiti in 1915 to secure American banks, investments, and remake the state to suit foreign creditors, a reminder that recognition often opens a door to fingers in the pocket. The indemnity's long tail stole futures. The world's first black republic was forced to spend much of its 19th century paying its former masters for the privilege of existing. And yet, 5 plain facts remain, stubborn as mountains. First, enslaved men and women in Saint Domingue began the destruction of Atlantic slavery at its richest terminus and completed it on their own ground. Second, they defeated the armies of 3 empires and a dozen admirals. Third, they founded a state that, however battered, forced the world to write a new sentence in the grammar of sovereignty. Fourth, the Revolution's shock helped crack the slave trade's legitimacy and altered the strategic calculus of empires from London to Washington to Madrid. Fifth, Haiti's name, given back to the island from its first people, stands for a promise that history cannot wholly annul, that those counted as property can make themselves a people.